cots, lying close together in the glow of dying embers. The room filled with a low red light, like the final heartbeat of the day. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright, but within, the world was safe and soft and warm, and as sleep took them. The father's breathing steady, the mother's sigh, the children's small. The fire's light flickered across the walls, painting faint, moving shadows that looked almost alive. In that kit something timeless unfolded, the knowledge that wherever humans go, however much they build, the true home remains where the fire burns. So through ages and empires, through wood and stone, through war and peace, the hearth endured. It glowed not only in cottages and halls, but in memory the oldest architecture of all. Walls of earth and spirit. When humanity first learned to build beyond the need for shelter, architecture began to echo something deeper. A search for belonging, for protection, not just of the body, but of the soul. In the centuries after Rome's fall, as villages settled and hearths grew steady, walls began to rise. Not grand yet, not carved in marble or fortified in stone, but shaped by humble hands, by faith, and by the slow rediscovery of craft. The world was quieter then. Roads, once busy with legions, had fallen to grass. Roman villas stood roofless and broken, their stones scattered and taken by peasants to build cottages, chapels, and boundary walls. The knowledge of architecture had not disappeared. It had only retreated, hidden within monasteries, and among the few who still remembered how arches held and mortar cured in sunlight. In that age of renewal, the first new buildings of meaning were not castles or courts, they were churches. Tiny, wooden, smoke-scented chapels rose beside fields and streams, their crosses carved from a single beam, their walls smelling of sap and rain. These were not yet the soaring cathedrals of later centuries, but modest sanctuaries, often built by the villagers themselves. The same hands that tilled the earth now shaped it into walls. Wattle and daub, a lattice of woven twigs, plastered with clay and straw, formed the first enclosures of faith. Inside, a simple altar stood upon a stone slab, draped in linen. The flicker of candles danced upon the rough walls, and the air felt still, as though time itself paused in reverence. Here, architecture became prayer in its purest form, not in grandeur, but in intention. Around these chapels, life began to settle differently. Homes clustered nearby, as though drawn to the safety of their shadow. Bells, small and uneven, were cast from melted metal tools and hung in wooden towers. When they rang often faintly, carried by the wind, they marked not power, but presence. The sound reminded people that they were not alone in a vast and unpredictable world. Gradually, as peace found fragile footing, stone returned to use. At first, it was rough. River stones gathered and set into walls with thick lime mortar. Then came dressed stone, carved more carefully. Builders learned again the lessons of weight and balance, and little by little, the architecture of faith began to shape the villagers themselves. Walls grew thicker, roofs pitched higher. Wooden shingles replaced thatch. Doorways were framed in arches, their curves gentle and strong. Inside, families placed small icons, carvings of saints, painted panels above their hearths. Religion no longer lived only in the chapel. It seeped into the home, shaping its rhythm and decoration. In these walls of earth and spirit, the boundary between sacred and ordinary blurred. The home became a reflection of the chapel, and the chapel a gathering of homes. Every stone, every beam, seemed to hold a quiet devotion. Even the act of building was often done with blessing, a prayer spoken as the cornerstone was laid, a cross carved upon the lintel. When the roof was set, the materials themselves told the story of place. In the north, houses were heavy and low, built from oak and turf to keep out the cold. In the south, lighter stone and plaster caught the sun and stayed cool through the long afternoons. Each wall bore the mark of the land. It came from every structure, a conversation between nature and need. But more than that, architecture began to reveal belief that a home could be both fortress and chapel, that the divine might dwell not only in temples, but in the ordinary corners of daily life. A mother hanging herbs near the window believed they blessed the air. A father carving a beam with simple symbols believed they guarded the family. Within the walls, patterns emerged, the cruciform mark etched into doors, the circle representing eternity, the spiral borrowed from older, pagan memory. Christianity and the earthbound wisdom that came before it intertwined quietly in these homes. The medieval house was, in its way, a book of symbols written in clay and wood. Monks, traveling from abbey to abbey, brought new ideas of form. They taught the art of mortar, the laying of stone courses, the setting of foundation trenches deep into the soil. Some of them became master builders, directing the raising of churches that would endure for centuries. Their architecture was not of luxury, but of order. A rhythm of columns and walls meant to reflect the order of heaven itself. In those years, monasteries grew into centers of learning and design. Behind their thick walls, scribes copied manuscripts, while builders shaped cloisters where silence could walk in circles. The arches there were round, steady, and humble, the Romanesque style reborn. From those same designs, smaller churches and villages took their cues, echoing the rhythm of monastic peace. The influence of faith touched even the layout of settlements. The cross of roads often met near a chapel. Wells were blessed, markets held beside sacred ground. The physical and spiritual world merged seamlessly. When one entered a village, it was often through a gate adorned with carved symbols, not only for defense, but for welcome. The wall, you see, had changed meaning. No longer merely a boundary, it had become a vessel of identity. Even the great halls of lords borrowed the imagery of faith. High windows were placed to let in light like a nav. Carved beams bore angels or vines. In stone or timber, in hut or hole, the spirit of the age pressed its hand into the work. The medieval mind did not separate architecture from life. Both were acts of devotion, both built to endure. Yet the people who built these homes rarely thought of themselves as architects. They were farmers, masons, carpenters, craftsmen following the memory of their fathers. Their walls were built slowly, carefully, by instinct. And though few of their names survive, their work became the foundation upon which centuries of architecture would stand. As the 12th century approached, stone began to speak more eloquently. Churches grew taller, windows widened, and walls carried not just weight, but meaning. The spirit of building became both earthly and heavenly, the walls of earth lifting toward the skies of spirit. In the quiet evenings, when work ceased and the last rays of sunlight brushed across the stone, families sat within their homes and looked upon those walls, not with pride, but with peace. They knew they had shaped something lasting, something that would protect their children and, perhaps, be blessed enough to outlive them. If you stood there, in that age of early faith and rebuilding, you would have felt it the hush between hammer blows, the reverence before raising a wall, the understanding that each home was a world unto itself. The fire still burned at the center, but now the walls around it held stories, prayers, and dreams. Within them, generations would be born, live, and pass, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke and the enduring echo of stone. And as twilight settled upon the fields, the sound of bells drifted through the air, calling both the builders and the faithful to rest. The day's work was done, the spirit's labor complete. In that mingling of earth and heaven, the medieval home found its soul. The manor emerges the landscape of medieval Europe was changing. The fields that once belonged to no one in particular now fell beneath the gaze of a single hall. Roads lengthened, borders formed, and names began to matter. From scattered cottages and chapels, a new order rose the manor. It began simply, almost invisibly. At first, it was just a larger house upon a hill, its roof higher, its walls broader, its gate more finely made. But in time, it became something far more, a symbol of rule, a center of labor and loyalty, the architectural heart of the feudal world. The manor was born from necessity. As villages grew and kingdoms took root, someone had to oversee the fields, to manage the sowing and the harvest, to offer protection when raids or famines came. The Lordus Hall became that anchor, a place where both authority and refuge could be found. Picture it now, if you will. The sun, low over rolling meadows, the sound of sheep bells and distant axes, smoke rising from the clustered cottages below. On a gentle rise stands a timber hall, its walls made of stout oak beams, its roof steep and shingled, glinting faintly in the light. A wooden palisade circles it, and beyond, The fields stretch out like a tapestry woven by many hands. The manor house was unlike the peasant cottages that surrounded it. It was built upward, reaching for the sky, not as a cathedral did, but as a mark of human ambition. The walls were thick, sometimes filled with earth for insulation, sometimes braced with stone. The door was broad and arched. Iron hinges held it firm. Inside, a single vast space, the great hall, dominated everything. The great hall was both home and theater. It was where the Lord dined, judged, and received his tenants. A hearth burned at its center, the smoke curling upward toward a vent in the roof beams. The light of the fire illuminated banners, shields, and carved beams blackened with years of use. At one end stood a raised platform, the dais, where the Lord and his household sat at a long table. Below, retainers, servants, and villagers gathered, depending on the occasion. Meals here were communal, though never equal. The Lord ate from pewter or silver, the others from wooden trenchers, but all shared the same warmth, the same stories, the same laughter. And though the manor embodied hierarchy, it also bound the community together. Each person, shepherd, smith, maid, or knight, had their place in the structure, as firmly set as the timbers in its frame. The architecture of the manor reflected this balance of might and dependence. Its walls were strong, but its doors remained open to those who worked the land. The hall's size was a statement, wide enough to host a feast, tall enough that the smoke could drift without choking the guests, and long enough to echo with music and speech. Above the hall, sometimes reached by a ladder or narrow stair, was a loft or a solar, a private room for the Lord and his family. It was a beginning of domestic privacy, something new in medieval life. Here, wooden shutters could close out the wind, and furs lined the benches. Candles burned low, and tapestries softened the sound of rain against the roof. Below, near the outer walls, smaller rooms evolved, buttery, pantry, and kitchen. Each served its purpose, though many were still little more than lean-tos. Against the main hall, smoke and smell filled every crevice, but no one minded. It was the scent of life, of work completed, of food sought. Outside, the manor's domain spread like a miniature world. There was the barn, where grain was stored, the byre, where cattle were sheltered, the bakehouse and brewhouse, where women tended the daily crafts of sustenance. There were gardens for herbs, orchards for fruit, fish ponds glimmering in the sun. A small mill might stand by a stream, its wheel turning with slow, eternal rhythm, the heartbeat of labor itself. Each building around the manor had its place, and together they formed a microcosm of medieval society. Architecture became the map of life. The farther from the Lord's hall one went, the humbler the structures became. Yet each was essential, and each bore the same care of hand wooden joints fitted by eye, thatch layered by season, walls whitewashed to reflect light. In time, the materials changed. Timber gave way to stone as wealth allowed. The manor's foundations deepened, its windows widened, carved doorways appeared, sometimes bearing coats of arms. Towers rose, first small, then more ambitious, symbols of permanence and lineage. What began as practicality became pride. The whole no longer merely sheltered, it declared. Still, amid the growing formality, life within the manor was deeply human. The rhythm of days was governed not by clock but by duty. The crowing of cocks, the call to work, the evening bell. At dawn, the steward walked the fields, taking stock of the laborers. The cook stoked the hearth before the others woke. In the solar, the lady of the house might spin or read prayers from a manuscript, her fingers tracing faded letters by firelight. Evenings brought gathering, candles flickered, dogs slept by the hearth, and the hall filled with voices. Minstrels sung recounting deeds of heroes or saints. The walls seemed to listen, absorbing each note into their wooden grain. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the manor in silence, broken only by the wind in the eaves. There was peace here, though it was hard-earned. The manor stood as both refuge and reminder, a place of shelter against storm and struggle, yet also a mark of the unequal world that shaped it. For beyond its fences, peasants toiled from dawn to dusk, their cottages humble and cold compared to the lord as a bright hole. The contrast was stark, yet accepted as the order of things divine, unchangeable, eternal. Over the generations, manors grew into the heart of medieval identity. They governed not just land, but time itself. Feasts marked the seasons, contracts bound labor and loyalty, and architecture carried it all. Every beam a record, every wall a law. To stand within a medieval manor was to feel the pulse of a civilization rediscovering its rhythm. Neither the chaos of the Dark Ages, nor the grandeur of empires past, but something balanced in between. The quiet assertion that life, however fragile, could be organized, sustained, and even celebrated. By the close of the 12th century, these manors dotted the countryside like constellations of power. Around them grew villages, churches, and the first stirrings of towns. The manor was not yet a castle, but it was its ancestor. The seed from which stone towers and moated walls would later rise. As night settles now in this tale, imagine one such hall. Its fire still glowing, its doors barred against the chill. Inside, the Lord's household sleeps, their breath soft, their dreams carried upward in the faint smoke curling through the beams. Outside, the stars wheel silently above the land, and the manor, steadfast and solemn, keeps its lonely vigil. Tomorrow, its people will rise again, to work, to serve, to build, and with each stone laid, each beam raised, the story of the medieval home moves one step closer to the castle. Defending the home, the Motte and Bailey. The world was growing restless again. Beyond the green fields and soft rolling meadows, Donjesti read raids from the sea, rival lords claiming land. The slow, thundering approach of an age where safety would have to be built, not hoped for. And so, from the quiet manor rose something new, a shape against the horizon that spoke not of hospitality, but of vigilance. A mound of earth, a ring of timber, a gate, a wall. The first castles. They were not the grand fortresses we picture now of gray stone and echoing halls. They began humbly, like everything else in the medieval world. Simple, functional, born of necessity. These were the Motte and Bailey castles, and though they were rough, they changed the face of Europe forever. Imagine the landscape. A small hill, sometimes natural, more often raised by hundreds of laboring hands. This was the motte, the mound upon which the lord's wooden tower would stand. Around it spread the bailey, a wide courtyard enclosed by a stout fence of sharpened logs, called a palisade. Beyond that, a ditch or moat, curved like a defensive embrace, filled with water or sharpened stakes. It was a structure of circles, earth, wood, and will. Together, they made the difference between survival and ruin. The timber tower atop the motte was called a keep, and though small, it commanded the world below. From its windows, the lord could see his fields, his village, his men. Smoke from cottages drifted upward like threads connecting the earth to his seat of watchful power. In storm or battle, it was the last refuge, the heart of the new medieval fortress. Below, within the bailey, life continued. Ordered, practical, alive. Here stood the kitchen, the smithy, the chapel, the stables, the soldiers' huts. Chickens clucked between the huts, dogs trotted through mud, and the ring of hammers echoed from the forge. The smell of wood smoke and horses filled the air. It was both home and garrison, a living community, bound within walls of defense. At dawn, the gates creaked open. Peasants left to tend the fields. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, and carpenters worked to mend what rain and time had worn. The drawbridge, when lowered, became both passage and warning, a threshold between safety and the unpredictable beyond. Inside the keep, the rooms were few and spare. The floor was often packed earth, the walls planked timber, their gaps stuffed with moss or straw. There was no luxury, only strength. The lord's family slept above the main hall, where a narrow stair led to a small chamber. Furniture was simple, a bed, a chest, perhaps a rough table and chair. Yet the sense of power there was unmistakable. The higher one climbed, the more one ruled. Outside, the bailey teemed with purpose. Bakers prepared bread for the garrison, fletchers made arrows. Blacksmiths sharpened blades. Even children had their tasks, fetching water, tending goats, or carrying messages. Each life was a thread in the fabric of defense. When danger came, as it often did, the transformation was swift. Horns sounded, gates slammed shut. Villagers rushed inside the palisade, driving their animals before them. Fires were doused to keep smoke low. Men lined the walls, bows ready, watching the tree line for movement. And when the first arrows flew, the Motan Bailey showed its strength, not in grandeur, but in endurance. For these early castles were not fortresses of stone, but living things of earth and timber. They could burn, yes, but they could also be rebuilt quickly. The mound stood eternal. The wood could rise again. In that, there was wisdom, a kind of flexibility the later stone castles would forget. At night, after battle or storm, the keep would glow softly from within. Torches burned low. Guards paced the ramparts, their shadows long against the palisade. From below, the sound of murmured prayers and restless animals filled the dark. The motte rose above it all, a silhouette against the moon, the new symbol of medieval security and of human adaptation. This architecture changed more than the landscape. It changed society. The manor had been a place of service and dependence. The Motan Bailey became a center of command. The Lord's word was law, his protection both gift and expectation. Fealty became physical. One lived within his walls, beneath his tower, within his reach. Yet despite the militaristic form, life here was not always harsh. During peaceful times, the Bailey was full of laughter and music. Festivals were held, banners flown, tournaments staged. Children played near the moat, throwing pebbles into the water. Women embroidered in the sunlight. Dogs lounged in doorways, and travelers found rest within the guarded gate. There was beauty in this balanced defense, and domesticity intertwined. The same walls that kept enemies out also kept families safe. The same drawbridge that could lift against invasion could lower to welcome guests. The Motan Bailey was a paradox of the medieval world, a fortress of fear and a cradle of life. The very act of building one was communal. Peasants dug the mound, carted earth in baskets, and tamped it firm. Carpenters raised palisades. Blacksmiths forged nails and hinges. Even monks sometimes helped, offering blessings as each beam was set. The process itself bound a village together, a labor of necessity and belonging. Over the years, these early fortresses grew more elaborate. Some gained double baileys. Others replaced their timber towers with stone keeps. The moats deepened, bridges strengthened, and gates became fortified structures in their own right. Each generation learned from the last, refining the art of defense. And slowly, a change of feeling spread across the countryside. The sight of a tower on the hill no longer meant only safety. It also meant power. The lord within was no longer just a steward of the land, but a figure of authority, perhaps even ambition. Architecture, once born from fear, began to shape identity. From the Motan Bailey would come the castles we still marvel at today. Those high walls and graceful towers, the stone steps and vaulted chambers. But within those later masterpieces, the spirit of the first timber fortresses still lived. The instinct to build, to protect, to gather one's people within a circle of light against the dark. When dawn returned after a long night of watch, mist often clung to the moat, and dew silvered the grass around the palisade. The air smelled of damp wood and ash. From the top of the motte, the view was endless. Fields stretching toward the horizon, smoke rising from cottages below, the quiet hum of survival resuming once more. And though the world outside was uncertain, within those wooden walls, the people of the Middle Ages found something precious, a sense of place, of endurance, of belonging. So the Motan Bailey stood not forever, for time and flame would claim them, but long enough to teach the world how to turn fear into form and danger into design. The day would come when timber gave way to stone, when the hill would become the heart of a fortress, and the simple wooden keep would be reborn as a castle. But in the quiet memory of medieval time, the first fortresses of wood and earth remained steadfast and humble. their story still echoing softly beneath every stone wall that followed. Stone rising. The age of castles, the wind over Europe had changed. What once whistled through wooden palisades now echoed across quarried hillsides. The lords of the Middle Ages were no longer content with timber towers that could catch flame or fall to rot. They hungered for endurance, something that would outlast their lifetimes, their children, perhaps even their kingdoms. And so the Age of Stone began. At first, the transformation was cautious. The old Motan Bailey form remained, but little by little, the walls stiffened, the towers hardened. The very sound of the hammer changed from the dull thud of wood to the ringing strike of chisel against rock. To build in stone was not merely to fortify. It was to declare one's place in the world. A timber keep could be raised in months. A stone castle could take decades. Every block that was set became a testament to ambition and wealth. The quarrymen dug through hillsides, carving the bones of the earth itself into square, obedient shapes. Lines of oxen hauled them on creaking wagons, and masons with sunburnt hands fitted each one with reverent precision. Imagine the sound, the sharp rhythm of chisels, the grating roll of carts, the shouted calls of men passing stone from hand to hand. Benet, the castle mound, widened and deepened. Ditches were cut into bedrock, foundations laid in layers of lime and gravel. These were not fragile walls, but living monuments. At the heart of the new fortress rose the stone keep, the soul of the castle. Thick walls, sometimes 20 feet across, climbed upward like cliffs. Narrow windows, shaped like inverted keyholes, looked out upon the surrounding land. Within, the light was dim but steady, falling through slits onto walls pale with chalk dust. The floors were no longer earth or plank, but flagstone cool beneath the feet, echoing with every step. Stairs coiled in tight spirals, designed so a defender retreating upward would have the sword arm free while his foe below struck against the curve. Even architecture had learned to think like a warrior. Inside, life was both austere and grand. The great hall became the castle's speedy heart, a long chamber with a raised dais at one end, where the lord and lady sat beneath banners bearing their colors. Fire burned in a central hearth, the smoke drawn upward through a vent in the roof. At night, the hall glowed with flickering torchlight. The scent of roasting meat and melted wax thick in the air. Here, the household gathered. Knights dined beside clerks and servants. Musicians played soft airs on lutes, and dogs sprawled near the fire. Though built for defense, the castle was also a home, a place of order, ceremony, and pride. Beyond the hall stretched a labyrinth of chambers. The solar, a private room for the family, offered warmth and privacy above the noise below. Thick curtains kept out drafts. Woolen hangings softened the chill of stone. There were chapels too, small, candlelit sanctuaries where prayers mingled with the smell of cold incense. Down below, the world was more practical. Kitchens, storerooms, and cellars filled the lower levels. Servants scurried with baskets of bread and barrels of ale. Blackened kettles simmered over coals. Nearby, deep wells ensured water even in siege, and narrow posterns led secretly out to the fields or riverbanks beyond the walls. Each part of the structure had a purpose. The towers guarded the corners, their round forms better at deflecting stones and fire. Battlements crowned the walls, narrow paths where archers could walk behind protective firing through the gaps. Gates became complex machines of defense, portcullises, murder holes, drawbridges. Even beauty here was born from necessity. Yet amid all this strength, the castle was never just a shell of war. Within its walls, generations were born. Children learned to walk. Laughter echoed in courtyards. The architecture shaped their days. Long corridors guided footsteps toward the chapel bells, and arrow slits let in just enough light to make shadows dance across the floor. When storms rolled in from the north, families would gather near the hearth. Servants broke cloaks, minstrels sang low songs about knights and lost crusades, and the wind battered the towers outside. The castle would groan like a living creature, yet it held firm. Within those walls, one could feel time slow, as if the world itself paused to breathe. To the peasants who tilled the Lord's fields, The sight of a stone castle on the horizon was almost mythic. It seemed not merely built by hands, but conjured by power. Its banners rippled in sunlight. Its bells called across miles of farmland. For them, it meant both safety and submission. A promise of protection and a reminder of distance. But even lords were subject to time. As decades passed, tastes changed. Castles grew more elaborate, their towers slender and graceful, their interiors softened with tapestries, carpets, and colored glass. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the castle had become more than a fortress. It was a symbol of civilization itself. In France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, every noble family sought to leave their mark in stone. Architects began experimenting with arches and vaults, blending strength with grace. The old square keeps gave way to curtain walls encircling open courtyards, and the once simple gatehouse became a grand entrance, flanked by towers and heraldic shields. Even the relationship between lord and land evolved. The castle no longer stood alone, as a solitary keep on a hill. Around its base grew castle towns, clusters of houses, shops, and inns that depended upon its protection. Markets gathered outside its gates. Pilgrims found rest within its shadow. Stone drew people, the way light draws moths. Inside, the rhythm of life persisted, quiet, deliberate, enduring. The cook stirred stew in the vast kitchen hearth. The smith shaped hinges for yet another gate. The priest whispered prayers in the dim chapel. In the upper rooms, a lady might sit by a window, embroidering by the thin daylight that slanted through glass imported from Venice. When night fell, the castle was a world apart. Torches burned along the corridors, their smoke curling into the arches above. Guards patrolled the battlements, their footsteps hollow on the stone. Somewhere, a hound barked in the courtyard. Somewhere else, a lute played a sleepy melody. Beyond the walls, the land stretched dark and endless. But here, in this fortress of light, humanity rested. These castles were not eternal. Many would crumble, others be conquered, and still more would fade into ivy-covered ruin. Yet their essence, the desire to make safety tangible, to carve permanence from impermanence, still lives in us. Each wall told a story, not of kings and battles alone, but of families, of work, of continuity. When dawn broke over a finished castle, sunlight washed across stone that would remain for centuries. The mason's marks were still visible in the mortar. The Lord's banner fluttered proudly in the morning wind. Below, peasants returned to the fields, their lives small but bound to that rising monument. Stone had triumphed. The age of castles had come, and with it, a world reshaped by the dream of endurance. And yet, within those walls of might, another story was beginning of art, comfort, and daily rhythm, of hearths and halls, kitchens and courtyards, of the quieter architecture of living itself. Life within the castle walls. Comfort in routine. Morning came gently to the castle, not with the cry of roosters, or the light spilling through wide windows, but with the dull toll of a bell echoing through corridors of stone. The air was cool, touched by the scent of damp lime and wood smoke. Somewhere, deep in the kitchens below, the first fires were being lit. Life within these walls followed a rhythm part necessity, part habit, and part unspoken tradition. Each day unfolded like a well-worn song, its verses known by all who lived there. Knights, servants, ladies, children, and cooks. At dawn, the guards on the battlements exchanged quiet greetings, stamping their boots against the chill. The watch changed hands. One group retired to the warmth of the guardroom while another took up their long vigil. Below, the kitchen stirred fully awake. Iron pots clanged. Bread was placed near the fire to bake, and the air filled with the earthy scent of barley porridge. For the servants, the day began before sunrise. Water had to be drawn from wells, rushes swept from the floors, torches replaced in sconces. The stone halls, though magnificent, were cold and stubborn. Every bit of warmth had to be earned. Servants carried bundles of wood up winding staircases, their breath misting in the early light. In the great hall, the heart of castle life, the remains of last night's fire still smoldered. A servant would kneel and coax the embers to life again, feeding it slowly until the flames brightened. Soon, the hall filled with the gentle hum of activity, maids dusting the long tables, dogs stretching by the hearth, the faint creak of a door opening as the steward entered to oversee the day's work. When the lord and lady descended, the castle stirred in full. The lord wore a heavy cloak lined with fur. The lady, a long gown with sleeves that trailed like whispers. Together, they presided over the morning meal. Simple fare of bread, cheese, and ale. Shared not in silence, but in quiet conversation about the business of the day. Messages arrived from neighboring estates. Sometimes a visitor was announced. The great gates would open, and hooves clattered in the courtyard as a messenger, a minor noble, entered beneath the raised portcullis. Pages would hurry to take cloaks, and the smell of wet leather would mingle with that of burning wood. Throughout the morning, life branched outward like streams from a river. In the courtyard, blacksmiths hammered at glowing iron, shaping hinges, horseshoes, and arrowheads. The rhythmic ringing of metal filled the air. In the stables, grooms brushed down horses, their hands quick and practiced. Inside, the kitchens were a kingdom of their own, vast, smoky, and full of life. The cooks were always in motion, stirring great cauldrons, turning spits of meat, or grinding herbs in stone mortar. The floor was warm from the ovens. Steam hung like mist in the air. Even here, architecture played its role. The high vaulted ceilings carried the smoke away, and the stone walls kept the heat steady. By midday, the castle's daily pulse quickened. The great hall was set for the principal meal, and the household assembled. Trestle tables were arranged, covered with linen cloths. The lord sat upon a raised dais, the family beside him, their retainers and guests spread below. Platters of roasted meat, trenchers of bread, bowls of fruit, and pitchers of ale made their slow way down the tables. Music often followed. Minstrels sang songs of ancient battles or courtly love, their melodies softening the edges of stone. Sometimes, the lady herself would play the harp, her notes drifting upward like birds against the rafters. Outside the hall, daily duties resumed. The castle was not a place of idleness. The lady oversaw the household stores, linen, candles, spices, and wine. The steward managed rents and supplies. Knights practiced in the bailey, their swords clanging as they trained. Pages and squires, young boys of birth, attended team learning the manners and skills expected of their station. Children of the household, meanwhile, studied reading, writing, and Latin under the tutelage of a priest. Their lessons echoed faintly in the chapel, mingling with the scent of beeswax and the quiet drip of holy water into the font. As the sun began its slow descent, the castle shifted into evening. The torches were lit along the corridors, their flames flickering against stone. The sound of shutters closing echoed faintly from the upper floors. The smell of supper drifted through the air, venison stew, fresh bread, perhaps a cup of warmed wine. Evening in the castle was softer, more reflective. The day's business faded, replaced by stories and laughter. The lord's household gathered once again in the great hall, the fire roaring high. Servants moved silently, refilling cups, carrying platters. Music wove between the voices. Sometimes, the priest would read aloud for text, or the minstrel would tell a tale of King Arthur, of dragons, or of saints. Shadows from the fire danced upon the walls, making the carved figures on the beams seem almost alive. When the final bell sounded for prayer, the castle grew still. Candles were extinguished, one by one. Guards took their posts for the night. The drawbridge was lifted, the gates barred. A hush fell across the courtyard. The lord and lady retired to their solar, where heavy curtains kept out the draught. They slept on thick feather beds, wrapped in woolen blankets, while the servants lay on pallets near the hearth or in the lower chambers. In distant towers, guards paced in silence, their footsteps echoing softly against the stones. Outside, the wind swept across the battlements. Owls called from the dark trees below. Inside, the castle breathed in sleep, the slow rhythm of 100 resting souls enclosed by walls that had seen both battle and peace. For all its power, the castle was a living thing, filled with warmth, fatigue, laughter, fear, and faith. It stood as a guardian, but also as a home. Every stair, every echoing corridor, bore the memory of footsteps, voices, and lives quietly unfolding within. When dawn came again, the bell would toll once more, and the routine would begin anew, steady as the heartbeat of stone itself. The medieval castle was not only a monument to defense, it was a reflection of endurance, of how humans can find comfort even within the coldest walls. Its beauty was not in decoration alone, but in rhythm and work and rest, noise and silence, day and night. And though centuries have passed and ivy now climbs where banners once flew, one can still imagine the life that pulsed inside the glow of the fire, the murmured prayers, the soft sound of a child's laughter echoing faintly down a corridor of stone. Village life beyond the walls. The common folks' homes outside the castle, where the land stretched into soft green fields and winding dirt roads. The true pulse of medieval life could be heard. The sound of chickens scratching in the dust, the steady thump of a mallet shaping a roof beam, the laughter of children chasing each other past the well. This was the heartbeat of the countryside. For all the grandeur of castles and manors, most people in the Middle Ages lived not within walls of stone, but beneath the thatched roofs of small cottages. The village was the cradle of medieval existence, its rhythm steady and enduring, tied to the seasons, the soil, and the will of the weather. From a distance, a typical medieval village looked almost like a patchwork of browns and greens. Houses huddled together near a church or by a winding stream, surrounded by fields that stretched outward like a great quilt. Beyond them lay the open land, the Lord's domain, the woods for gathering firewood, and the commons where animals grazed. Each cottage told a story of labor and love, built from what the land provided: timber from the nearby forest, mud, and straw from the fields. They were modest, but sturdy. The walls were often wattle and daub, a lattice of woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, soil, and dung. The roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, thick enough to keep the rain away, but home to the occasional bird or mouse. Inside, the air was warm with smoke and the scent of earth. There were no chimneys in the early centuries, only a central hearth where the fire burned day and night. The smoke found its own way out, curling up through the thatch or drifting through small gaps in the roof. Above the flames, an iron hook held a pot, the center of daily life. Furniture was simple, handmade: a table of rough planks, a few stools, a wooden chest, and perhaps a bench by the wall. Along one side, a bed of straw or wool blankets served the family. Sometimes, several slept together for warmth. Children curled beside their parents, while a dog or a chicken might wander close to the embers. At dawn, the village stirred early. The sound of a cock crowing broke the silence, followed by the creak of doors and the clatter of wooden buckets. Women fetched water from the well, their skirts brushing dew-damp grass. Men gathered near the fields, shouldering wooden plows or leading oxen with calm patience. The fields themselves were divided by long, narrow strips, part of the open field system that shaped so much of medieval life. Each family held several scattered strips, ensuring no one had the best or worst land alone. Farming was communal, guided by season and sun. In spring came the plowing and sowing. In summer, the weeding and tending. In autumn, the harvest. The village worked together. When one family's thatch caught fire, neighbors came running with boots. When a new cottage was built, hands gathered to lift beams and pack daub. The sense of shared effort was as strong as any wall of stone. But life was not without hardship. The winters were long and biting. Smoke clung to the ceilings, and frost crept in through cracks. Food was stored carefully: salted meat, dried beans, and grain kept in wooden bins. Hunger was an old, familiar guest that no one ever truly forgot. Still, the villagers made joy where they could. Feast days brought color and laughter, the ringing of the church bell calling everyone together. Tables were set outdoors, songs filled the air, and children ran wild between the stalls. Evenings were 4 stories, told by firelight, passed from voice to voice. Tales of saints and travelers, of strange lands and clever animals. The church stood at the heart of it all. It was often the only stone building in the village, its small bell tower rising above the thatched roofs like a watchful guardian. Within, the air was cool and still. Villagers gathered there not just for prayer, but for comfort. Births, marriages, deaths, all marked beneath its wooden beams. Faith bound them together. A quiet thread through the days. The village craftspeople gave the settlement its pulse. The blacksmith's forge was a place of fire and rhythm, the ring of hammer on iron echoing across the green. The mill, powered by wind or water, ground grain into flour, its slow turning wheel a constant song of sustenance. The baker's oven, built of clay, glowed softly each morning, filling the air with the scent of bread. Children, meanwhile, lived in a small but vivid world. They helped with chores, chasing geese, gathering firewood, fetching water, but found play in everything. A bundle of sticks became a sword. A puddle became a lake for leaf boats. They learned by imitation, by rhythm, by the patience of repetition. Evenings were gentle. Smoke curled from thatched roofs, settled into rest. Outside, stars blinked faintly above the thatch. It was a simple life, but not an empty one. Every season brought its rhythm, every task its meaning. There was dignity in labor, in the shaping of earth and wood, in the tending of small lives. Though the villagers might never see the world beyond a few miles from their home there, lives were woven into the great tapestry of the medieval age, their cottages and fields as vital as the castles that loomed in the distance. When dawn came again, mist rose from the meadows, and the fields shone silver with dew. The bell called out once more, and another day began. Another fire was kindled, another loaf of bread baked, and so, beneath that humble thatch, the story of medieval life endured quiet, resilient, and beautifully human. Town and trade. The rise of medieval cities, the countryside slept beneath its patchwork of fields and farms. But somewhere beyond, the air had begun to change. The rhythm of life was no longer ruled by the bell of a single village church or the will of the seasons alone. The age of trade was stirring, and with it came the birth of something entirely new. The medieval town. At first, they were little more than market gatherings. Crossroads where merchants stopped to sell their wares, or river crossings where tolls were paid and goods exchanged. But like seeds scattered on fertile soil, these places began to grow. A few tents became stalls. Stalls became streets. And soon, a town rose, where once there had been only open land. The great castles and monasteries helped give them form. Around their walls, workers gathered: carpenters, weavers, bakers, masons, each man and woman seeking protection and opportunity. The Lord all about encouraged the settlement, for every shop and workshop meant rent, taxes, and labor. Thus, the heartbeat of medieval commerce began to sound beneath the ringing of church bells. The architecture of these early towns was unlike anything the countryside had known. Streets wound, narrow and uneven, paved in cobbles worn smooth by countless feet. Timber-framed houses leaned toward one another, their upper stories almost touching above the lanes. From open windows hung baskets, drying herbs, or laundry fluttering like flags of daily life. The smell of the town was unforgettable, a mingling of fresh bread, tanned leather, and smoke, mixed with the sharp scent of tallow, fish, and the river that flowed nearby. It was messy, crowded, alive. Each town had its market square, the true heart of civic life. At dawn, traders arrived with carts heavy with grain, wool, spices, or pottery. The air filled with shouts and laughter, the clatter of scales weighing flour or salt, the bray of donkeys pulling loads of goods. Women bargained for vegetables. Children darted between stalls. Here, coins passed hands in a rhythm that spoke of a new kind of power. Not of the sword, but of trade. The merchant's house was distinct. Unlike the simple cottages of peasants, it rose tall and narrow, built to fit into crowded streets. The ground floor served as a shop, its wide shutters opening to the street, while the family lived above. The walls were of timber and plaster, the beams dark with age, and the floorboards creaked beneath the constant movement of life. Inside, the rooms were small but richly furnished compared to rural homes. Chests held imported cloth or spices, candles flickered in iron sconces, a crucifix or small icon watched over the hearth. There was warmth here, not from great fires like in the castle, but from steady prosperity. The guilds gave the towns their order and pride. Each craft, whether it be blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, or weavers, formed a brotherhood that regulated quality, prices, and apprenticeship. To belong to a guild was to hold identity and honor. Apprentices worked long hours for years, learning every detail of their craft before becoming journeymen, and perhaps one day, masters with shops of their own. The guild halls stood proudly in the town square. Grand timber buildings adorned with carved crests, banners, and sometimes stained glass windows showing the tools of their trade. Within, meetings were held, feasts enjoyed, and disputes settled. The sound of laughter, tankards clinking, and plans being made echoed long into the night. As towns grew, so did ambition. Walls began to rise, not to keep peasants out, but to protect trade within. These were not the private walls of a castle, but city walls, built by citizens, for citizens. Watchtowers overlooked gates, and drawbridges spanned the moats. Each gate had a name, and each name carried stories of travelers, merchants, and pilgrims who passed beneath. Within these walls, architecture blossomed. The churches of the towns reached skyward, built higher and lighter than those of the countryside. The style was changing, the heavy Romanesque giving way to the Gothic, where pointed arches and stained glass lifted the eye and spirit toward heaven. In daylight, colors poured through the glass like liquid jewels, painting the stone floors in shades of crimson and gold. The cathedral became the heart of the city's pride, built not in years, but in generations. Masons carved their names secretly into the stones, as if leaving messages to the future. Each tower, each gargoyle, each arch told of faith, skill, and time. Around it, the town hummed endlessly. Bells marked every hour. Carts rumbled. Merchants shouted prices. Apprentices ran errands through the labyrinth of streets. Water was fetched from public fountains, and gossip spread faster than rumor. The town never truly slept. Even at night, taverns glowed with candlelight and the murmur of song. Life here was crowded, yes, but alive with possibility. A farmer's son could become a merchant. A craftsman's daughter might marry into wealth. The rigid hierarchy of the countryside softened beneath the weight of coin and skill. Trade, not birth, began to shape one's fortune, but the town also carried its shadows. Disease spread quickly where people lived close together. Fire was a constant threat. One stray spark, and whole streets could vanish overnight. Yet even disaster could not stop the momentum. Each time, they rebuilt, stronger, smarter. Their walls a little higher, their wells a little deeper. As centuries passed, the medieval town grew into something even more complex. The city, London, Paris, Florence, and Bruges swelled with life. Rivers became arteries of commerce. Bridges carried both traffic and trade. Markets expanded into fairs that drew merchants from across continents. In these cities, architecture became art. Stone bridges replaced wooden ones. Public halls were adorned with carvings. Clock towers rose to mark time with precision unheard of. Before, life moved faster, louder, brighter. The streets filled with color, red robes of scholars, blue tunics of merchants, brown cloaks of pilgrims. Language itself began to blend, as traders from Italy, Flanders, and the East brought new words and ideas. The air was thick with sound. The cry of hawkers, the ring of anvils, the toll of bells marking both prayer and profit. And yet, beneath all the movement and change, something familiar remained. The rhythm of human life, work, rest, faith, and hope pulsed the same as it did in the village, in the manor, even in the castle. The walls were different, the tools more complex, but the longing was the same. To build, to belong, to leave behind something that endured. When evening came to the medieval city, the marketplace emptied. The lamps were lit, and a hush settled over the narrow streets. Smoke drifted from 1,000 chimneys into the night air. The river below reflected the moon, and the tall spire of the cathedral stood silent against the stars. Somewhere, a bell tolled the hour deep, sonorous, steady. The sound rolled across rooftops, through alleyways, over walls. It was the same music that had guided all of medieval life, a harmony of labor, devotion, and time itself. And so the medieval world, once scattered across fields and fortresses, had found its center in stone and sound in the streets and walls of its growing towns. The age of villages had given birth to the age of cities, and with it, a new chapter of living and building had begun. Cathedrals and craftsmanship. The soul of medieval designing the heart of every medieval town stood something larger than life itself, a cathedral that seemed to hold both heaven and earth. In its embrace, it did not simply dominate the skyline. It defined Italiano. For centuries, travelers could spot a city by the Great Mason's challenge. The cathedral was not only a place of worship, but the heart of identity, the soul of the city made visible. The earliest cathedrals were built in the Romanesque style, thick walls, small windows, round arches, and a sense of fortitude. They felt like fortresses of faith, heavy with purpose. Inside, the dim light fell upon frescoes of saints and kings, and the air smelled of incense and cold stone. But soon, something changed. The medieval world began to look upward, spiritually and architecturally. The new style that emerged, the Gothic, sought not to protect from heaven but to reach toward it. Builders discovered that if they replaced the round arch with a pointed one, weight could be distributed differently. Suddenly, walls could grow thinner, windows larger, and towers higher. Thus began an age of light. Imagine the moment a town laid the first foundation stone. The entire community gathered, lords, monks, merchants, peasants, as if planting the soul of their city in the ground. Prayers were said. Bells rang. A procession carried relics to be sealed within the stone. It was an act of hope in stone and time. The master mason was the unseen genius behind it all. He understood how to turn rock into air, how to make gravity itself part of beauty. With chalk and compass, he marked designs on tracing floors. Vast slabs of plaster were arches. Vaults and columns were drawn life-size. His apprentices studied every curve, every intersection of lines. The craftsmen who followed were a brotherhood of quiet brilliance. Each one had a gift. Some carved columns like twisting vines, others shaped saints from blocks of limestone. The glaziers worked with glass and flame, coaxing from sand the colors of the rainbow. The blacksmiths forged iron into hinges and crowns for windows, and the carpenters built scaffolds so tall they swayed in the clouds. Their tools were simple mallets, chisels, ropes, and pulleys. Yet from them rose miracles. Each sound in the cathedral's making became part of its eternal music. The hammer striking stone, the creak of wood, the call of builders across the height. At the heart of every cathedral was its light. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, vast roses and tall lancets, transforming stone into living color. Reds burned like embers, blues flowed like rivers, golds glimmered like morning. These windows told the stories of saints and scriptures for a people who could not read. Each beam of light was both sermon and song. The vaults above were like the ribs of a vast creature, curved, interlaced, alive. To stand beneath them was to feel small and infinite all at once. The ceilings seemed to float, though every inch was anchored in perfect geometry. Then there were the gargoyles, grotesque and beautiful, perched high upon parapets. To some, they were guardians. To others, warnings. When rain fell, it poured from their mouths in silvery streams. They reminded the townsfolk that even holiness must laugh at itself sometimes. Every stone had a purpose, and every purpose was layered with meaning. The transepts formed the arms of a cross, the nave its body, and the choir its voice. To walk through a cathedral was to walk through a living symbol, a theology and architecture. At night, the masons left their tools beside half-carved angles, and the city slept beneath the rising towers. Candles burned in chapels where monks prayed for those who built by day. the rhythm of labor and worship intertwined, day after day, year after year, until faith itself became the mortars that held the walls together. Some cathedrals took 200 years to complete. A mason might die having worked only on one arch, yet he would die content, knowing it was part of something eternal. The building itself was a bridge, not only between heaven and earth, but between generations. When travelers entered a finished cathedral for the first time, they often wept. The scale, the light, the silence. It was as if the air itself had been sanctified. Inside, everything slowed. The hum of the city outside faded into whispers. The sound of footsteps echoed like heartbeat and prayer on feast days. The cathedral came alive. Bells rang out. Music filled the vaults, and incense coiled like smoke from a sacred fire. The people, rich and poor, alike, gathered beneath the same roof, equal in the eyes of faith and stone. And in the evening, when the last candles burned low, the cathedral remained, silent yet alive, a breathing monument of devotion. Outside, the stars seemed dimmer beside its towers. Inside, the cold stone remembered every chisel, every hand, every soul that had built it. Cathedrals were not just places to worship. They were books written in architecture, telling the story of humanity's reach for something beyond itself. The mason's craft became a prayer in motion, the artist's color a hymn of light. Every piece, from the smallest carved leaf to the tallest spire, sang the same song. Beauty is faith made visible. And though centuries have passed, their stones still stand in Chartres, in Canterbury, in Cologne. They have outlasted kings and wars, outlasted those who built them and those who prayed within. The world has changed, but their message has not. Tat creation, when born of devotion, endures beyond time. So as the night deepens, and the echoes of hammer and chant fade into memory, imagine the glow of candles beneath vaulted arches, the scent of wax and dust and prayer. Imagine standing there, small, silent, odd, as the great cathedral breathes softly around you. For in that stillness lies the heart of the medieval world, a harmony of faith, craftsmanship, and light, shaped forever into stone. Cathedrals and craftsmanship, the soul of medieval design homes of the wealthy. Comfort, display, and domestic power as the bells of the cathedral echoed across the town. Another kind of life unfolded behind heavy oak doors. Quieter, softer, but no less deliberate. Here, within the fortified manors and grand city houses of the wealthy, architecture became a language of status and security. The medieval nobleman's home was more than shelter. It was a statement carved in stone. It spoke of lineage, alliances, and success. The great lords had their castles, of course. But as peace settled across regions and trade brought prosperity, new kinds of homes emerged to manor, houses in the countryside, and merchant halls within the city walls. Each was built to impress, to comfort, and to protect. In the countryside, a manor rose like a smaller echo of a castle. The great hall still stood at its heart, but it no longer served as a fortress. The walls, though thick, now bore windows, larger, glazed, with translucent glass instead of shutters of wood. For the first time, sunlight softened the stone interiors, filtered through panes that shimmered faintly like frozen water. The layout of these homes reflected the ordered world of their owners. The ground floor was a domain of service kitchens, pantries, and storage rooms bustling with servants. Above, the noble family lived, surrounded by tapestries and painted walls, their chambers connected by carved staircases and arched corridors. Every object within was both useful and symbolic. The hearth was vast, with room enough to stand inside. Its smoke rose through stone chimneys that marked the skyline, a quiet sign of progress. Before it stood heavy tables of oak or walnut, polished until they gleamed, their surfaces carved with family crests or vines that wound like living roots dot around these tables. Nobles dined on silver dishes, their meals served by attendants in livery. The air carried the aroma of roasted meats, herbs, and freshly baked bread. Candles flickered in wrought iron sconces, their light dancing upon goblets of pewter and glass. And above, the ceilings, once bare beams, were now painted with flowers, stars, or scenes from hunting and legend. Even the architecture spoke of taste and control. The bedchamber was both sanctuary and stage. A canopied bed, draped in embroidered linen and velvet, stood upon a raised dais. It was less a piece of furniture than a throne of sleep, layered with blankets and cushions stitched by hand. Beside it, a chest held garments, tunics lined with fur, silk robes, fine shoes. Every fold, every thread was a mark of refinement. In city homes, the merchantry lived no less grandly, though their spaces were narrower. The merchant's hall house often rose 3 or 4 stories tall, each floor serving a purpose. The ground level was a shop or storeroom, the middle 4, family and guests, and the upper 4 sleeping. Unlike rural estates, these houses opened directly onto the street, their facades richly decorated with carvings or painted signs showing the trade: a golden key for a locksmith, a sheaf of cloth for a draper, a ship for a spice merchant. The interiors glowed with color and texture: tapestries from Flanders, Venetian glass, rugs from the East. The fireplace became the heart of comfort and conversation. Around it gathered family and guests on cold evenings, sipping wine or ale while minstrels played the lute. The scent of burning oak mixed with candle wax and beeswax polish. Laughter echoed off the plastered walls. Servants moved quietly through this world, unseen yet essential. They tended fires, poured drinks, washed linens, and ensured that everything, from the polishing of silver to the turning of tapestries with the seasons, reflected order and prosperity. Even private chapels became common in great houses. These small sanctuaries mirrored the grandeur of the cathedrals in miniature, their altars adorned with icons and candles. The wealthy could now pray within their own walls, a luxury of devotion that once belonged only to monasteries. As comfort increased, so too did the attention to privacy, a concept the medieval world was just beginning to understand. The bedchamber doors grew thicker. Screens separated eating areas, and family quarters were set apart from those of servants. No longer did life revolve entirely around the great hall. Rooms gained purpose: the solar for conversation, the garderobe for cleanliness, the study for reading or writing letters. The materials of construction reflected wealth as well. Stone remained the symbol of permanence, but within its frame, wood, plaster, and glass turned cold walls into homes. Floors were sometimes tiled with colored patterns, or strewn with rushes scented with herbs to keep insects at bay. That color ruled everything. Not the pale tones we imagine today, but bold reds, blues, and greens. Walls were painted in intricate designs or covered with woven fabric. Furniture was carved and gilded, and the smallest details, hinges, candelabras, were shaped with care. The garden, too, became part of the architecture. Enclosed by walls, it was both retreat and display. Roses climbed trellises, fountains trickled softly. Benches offered quiet corners for thought or courtly talk. Peacocks strutted across lawns, symbols of pride and splendor. And yet, beneath all the beauty, the architecture still whispered of its defensive past. Windows, though glazed, remained narrow. Doors were thick and barred. Staircases twisted in ways that could still confuse an intruder. The memory of unrest lingered in every stone dot at dusk. When candles glowed and shadows lengthened, the noble home felt like a world apart. Outside, the town or village lay quiet under starlight. Inside, the flicker of flame turned gold upon the tapestries. The lord and lady sat near the hearth, speaking softly of alliances, trade, and family. A servant tuned a lute. Another poured wine. The fire crackled out here. The medieval dream of comfort had come alive, not through excess, but through craft and control. Every beam, every carving, every woven thread was a mark of human hands shaping a gentler world. The architecture of wealth was no longer about walls of defense, but walls of identity. It spoke not to the sword, but to the soul's desire for beauty, order, and belonging. In time, These homes would give rise to the monoculture of the Renaissance, the transformation of fortresses into palaces, of halls into salons. But their roots lay deep in this medieval soil, where every corner held both history and hearth, and as the last candle burned low, leaving the carved beams lost in shadow, one might imagine that the house itself was breathing the echo of footsteps, the hush of tapestries, the sigh of wood settling into stillness. For in the medieval home of the wealthy, time itself seemed to rest, wrapped in warmth, guarded by stone, and lit by the steady glow of faith and fortune. Peasants and everyday life. The humble homes of the many morning begins early in the medieval village. Before the first light reaches the hills, a cock crows, and smoke curls from a chimney made of clay and stone. The world stirs not in marble halls or manor chambers, but in cottages no larger than a single nobleman's room. Here, in the homes of the peasants, life is both simple and complete. Every wall, every tool, every beam tells a story of survival. These homes may not reach for a heaven-like cathedral, but they touch the earth with quiet strength. The peasant's house, sometimes called a crofter's hut or yeoman's cottage, was made from what the land offered. Wattle and dube, a woven lattice of branches plastered with mud and straw, formed the walls. The roof was thatched with reeds, bound tightly against wind and rain. The floor was of packed earth, hard and uneven beneath bare or leather-wrapped feet. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and hay. The hearth, built from stone or clay, burned at the center, not just for warmth, but for life itself. It was the heart of the house, used for cooking, for light, and for gathering when night fell. Smoke often drifted freely, escaping through a small hole in the roof or door, leaving the beams blackened with soot dot. There was little furniture, but what existed was sturdy and made by hand. A table of rough-hewn wood, a few stools, a bench against the wall. A chest held tools and the family's few garments. In one corner, straw mattresses lay upon the floor, shared by parents, children, and sometimes the newborn animals on cold nights. The architecture of simplicity followed function, not fashion. The walls were thick enough to block the chill. The low ceiling trapped heat, and the small windows kept the wind at bay. In wealthier villages, glass was still a rarity. Most windows were covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters that let in dim light by day and shut out the dark at night. The peasant's day revolved around the land. As dawn broke, families stepped out into misty fields, tools in end wooden plows, sickles, spades. Their homes were not separate from their work, but an extension of it. The cottage was built close to the fields, the barn attached to one side, and a small garden at the back growing leeks, beans, and herbs. The rhythm of life was seasonal. Spring brought planting, summer brought harvest, autumn the storing of grain, and winter the long nights by the fire. Every task was a thread in the fabric of survival, mending thatch, tending animals, brewing ale, spinning wool. Evenings were slow and gentle. Families gathered by the hearth, eating potake, a stew of grains and vegetables, and dark bread baked in the village oven. Stories were told softly, songs hummed under breath. The sound of a spinning wheel joined the crackle of firewood. Outside, the night stretched, quiet and wide. Though humble, these homes held more. They held community. Villages were close-knit webs of shared labor and mutual dependence. Roofs were repaired together, fields plowed in teams, harvests shared when storms came. The architecture of a village was not individual, it was collective, shaped by necessity and trust. Most cottages faced inward toward a common green, where livestock grazed and children played. A narrow dirt lane wound through, connecting the cottages to the church at one end and the fields at the other. Beyond lay the manor house, right guardian, though often distant in both size and spirit. Inside these modest dwellings, decoration was rare, but not absent. Some walls were whitewashed, others bore simple charms, herbs hung to dry, a wooden cross, or a painted symbol to keep away evil. On feast days, the cottage might glow with a touch of color. A woven cloth on the table, a garland of wildflowers. In winter, the The sound of wind against the thatch could be fierce. The family huddled close by the fire, patching clothes, repairing tools, or simply watching the flames dance. The scent of burning peat or oak mingled with the faint sweetness of stored apples and drying herbs. Despite hardship, there was warmth in the ordinary. The architecture, though crude by noble standards, was alive. It grew, changed, and aged with the family. When a new child was born, a wall might be extended. When the roof sagged, neighbors helped rebuild it. The home was not a monument, but a living thing. For those few peasants who prospered, freeholders or yeomen, their cottages evolved. They added stone foundations, separate rooms, perhaps even glass windows or a small loft. The distinction between poor and comfortable could be measured in the size of the hearth and the number of beams overhead. The daily life that unfolded within these walls was steady, cyclical, and rooted in endurance. Every meal, every chore, every evening by the fire carried a quality, a rhythm, that shaped medieval life far more than the courts or cathedrals ever did. On Sundays, the village emptied into the church, the only stone building most peasants ever entered. Its cool walls and stained glass were a glimpse into another world. The same faith that inspired cathedrals, distilled into humble form. When the bells rang, the sound echoed over thatched roofs, through the fields, and into every hearth. And when night fell and the fields darkened, the village became a constellation of quiet lights, each hearth a small sun in the sea of countryside. Smoke rose into the still air, mingling with mist, carrying the scent of wood and bread and simple life. If castles spoke of power and cathedrals of heaven, then the peasant cottage spoke of persistence. It was the architecture of survival, a shelter built not for grandeur, but for the sacred act of living one more day. There was beauty in its roughness, the worn threshold smoothed by generations of feet, the soot-darkened rafters, the faded herbs once hung. Every imperfection was honest, every crack a record of time. So when we speak of the medieval world, it is not only the lords and masons we should remember, but these quiet builders to the farmers, the mothers, the children who shaped a civilization from soil and fire. Their homes may have crumbled back into the earth, their names lost to time, but the rhythm they created of work, rest, and simple faith still beats softly beneath history as a grander stones the medieval world. After all, was not built from castles alone. It was built from cottages, small, enduring, and full of life. Legacy of stone and hearth. Medieval world, that long stretch of centuries between collapse and rebirth, now lies behind us. Quiet, but not gone. Its echoes still hum beneath the soil and in the bones of old towns. You can hear it when footsteps fall on cobbled streets, or when wind drifts through an open archway of a ruined abbey. The story of medieval architecture, of homes both humble and grand, has always been a story of endurance, of people shaping stone, timber, and earth to guard them against time. In the beginning, homes were fragile things. Wattle daub walls leaned against winter storms, roofs of straw bent under the rain. Yet even in those crude huts, there was a rhythm of life, bread baking over embers, the steady heartbeat of the hearth, and the murmur of voices that made shelter into something sacred. From that simplicity, everything else grew. Generations passed, and Wheatsich, the hand of humankind, learned a little more. Beams were laid straighter, stones were cut cleaner, roofs began to pitch high, and windows to open wider. The hut became a cottage. The cottage a hole, the hall a manor, and above all, castles rose, not merely as fortresses of might, but as monuments of imagination. A stone castle was the ultimate medieval dream. Safety, permanence, and pride carved into the land itself. But beyond the battlements, the true heart of the Middle Ages beat softly in quieter places, in village hearths, in cloisters, in the small corners where life unfolded without grandeur. The washerwoman's hands reddened in cold water. The shepherd's hut stood alone on the hill, where smoke curled from a single hole in the roof. These lives left few traces in stone, yet their rhythm was the pulse that kept the great world alive. Inside the walls of the castle, things were changing too. The great hall that once served every purpose began to divide into chambers, private rooms, corridors, and quiet spaces where families could withdraw. Architecture began to mirror emotion, the slow emergence of privacy and comfort. The heavy stone became human, shaped for living rather than defense. Fires grew smaller and steadier. Beds rose higher. Glass appeared in the windows, softening the world's rough edges. Meanwhile, to craftsmen, the unseen hands of the age continued their patient work. Stonemasons traced perfect curves in the air before striking the chisel. Carpenters measured, cut, and whispered to the grain of oak. Every beam, every carved arch told of human persistence, a promise that beauty could be built even in hard times. Their marks remain, sometimes hidden, inside beams or on the underside of stones. Symbols, initials, blessings against misfortune. Their lives ended centuries ago, but their work still holds. As the Gothic age dawned, the world itself began to rise upward. Churches stretched taller, spires reached into clouds, and windows became oceans of color and light. Home and faith intertwined. Architecture was no longer just about walls, but about wonder. Even small chapels echoed the shape of great cathedrals, as if each home longed to borrow a little of heaven. The towns grew busier now. Markets crowded beneath timbered roofs. Merchants built tall, narrow houses with workshops below and rooms stacked high above. The medieval street became a living thing, noisy, scented with bread and smoke and iron. For the first time, people began to live close, sharing not just walls, but the sound of each other's lives. Yet even as stone soared higher, the old hearth remained. Every home, no matter how grand or simple, kept a fire burning. Around that light, generations gathered. The architecture might change, the walls thicker, the ceilings vaulted, but the need for warmth, for a center, never faded. The medieval hearth was more than an architectural feature. It was the soul of home. By the late Middle Ages, the line between defense and comfort blurred. Moats grew still. Towers softened into ornament. The Lord's Hall filled with tapestries and laughter rather than soldiers and shields. Across Europe, the sound of construction slowed. The age of castles gave way to the age of manor houses, then cities. The medieval home had completed its long evolution from shelter to statement, from necessity to art dawed and still. Beneath all that transformation, something gentle endured, the idea that a home is not merely built, but lived in. The stones remember the warmth of fire, the pattern of footsteps, the echo of laughter. Even when the roofs fell and ivy crawled over the walls, the essence of home remained, humming like a quiet song beneath ruin. When we look at medieval buildings today, at a lonely castle ruin under a gray sky or a cottage with a sagging thatch, we are not just seeing the past. We are standing within a memory that never quite ended. The stones were once touched by living hands. The rooms once held stories whispered in the dark. So, the story of medieval living, from huts to castles, is not only about architecture, but about endurance, creativity, and the eternal human desire to belong somewhere. Each generation built upon the remains of the last, carrying forward an unbroken chain of homes and hearts. And though the centuries have turned, though the castles are quiet and the villages have grown in, the medieval spirit still lingers in the curve of an archway, in the hearth's quiet glow, in every home built to hold warmth against the world's coldness. Tonight, as the story closes and your thoughts drift toward rest, imagine those old walls standing under the moon. Imagine the smell of oak smoke and the hush of stone corridors. The medieval world is far behind us, yet its calm strength endures in every corner of human dwelling, in every dream of shelter, peace, and home. Sleep. Now, the fire still burns somewhere beyond time, its glow falling softly on the stones of history. Medieval living, from huts to castles, and so our journey comes to rest. From smoky huts beside forest edges to grand halls of stone and song, the Middle Ages remind us that even in hard times, people built warmth from the cold and beauty from the earth. Architecture was not just stone and wood, it was a reflection of life itself. Fragile, patient, enduring. And though the centuries have faded, their echoes still whisper through every home that stands today. Thank you, dear listener, for traveling through time with Go to Sleep Historian. If this story brought you calm, peace, or gentler rest, please subscribe, like, and share our work, so that more dreamers can wander with us through history's quiet places. Until next time, sleep softly, and let the firelight of the past guide you into dreams. Medieval living, from huts to castles. Welcome, dear listener, to Go to Sleep Historian. Tonight, we travel back through the winding centuries to the world that rose from ruin and built itself again. One beam, one stone, one dream at a time. This is the story of how people once lived, from humble huts of earth and timber to the towering castles that touch the sky. It is the story of home, of warmth, work, and quiet endurance through the long Middle Ages. So, settle your mind. Let the noise of the day fall away. Breathe softly as we begin our journey into the heart of the medieval world. Before we start tonight's story, if you are visiting Go to Sleep Historian for the first time, we kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another peaceful tale of history. And if this story helps you rest, please leave a like or a gentle comment. It helps our small hearth of history keep burning. Now, let the past unfold and let your thoughts drift as we begin medieval living, from huts to castles. After the Empire, a world rebuilt. The Roman Empire has fallen. Its marble cities have grown quiet, and weeds rise between the cracks of once great roads. Broken columns lean against the wind, and statues of forgotten emperors stare toward empty horizons. Across the old provinces, silence lingers like a low mist. The vast order that once connected Europe has faded, leaving only echoes of coin in the dirt, a broken aqueduct. The outline of an ancient wall now claimed by ivy. In Tiskiet, a new kind of world begins to stir. It is smarter, simpler, and humbler, but full of life's persistence. Where once stood stone villas with painted walls, people now build with what lies at hand. Branches, mud, straw, and patience. In these ruins of empire, the first medieval homes are born. The forests return first. Oak and ash reclaim the Roman fields, and wolves tread where soldiers once marched. The air feels older, heavier, with the scent of rain-soaked wood. Travelers move cautiously, guided by stars and memory rather than roads. In the heart of these woods, a clearing opens. Smoke curls from a thatched roof, no taller than a man. Here, a family gathers around a flickering fire, the glow spilling through gaps. This is not a grand home. The walls are made from woven branches coated in clay. The floor is earth, and the roof is bound straw, heavy with dew. Yet in its simplicity, there is warmth. Inside, children sleep close to their mother, and beside them, a small pig and 2 chickens settle for the night. The scent of smoke, hay, and soil mixed together. The smell of survival. Architecture, if we may call it that, is no longer about grandeur. It is about endurance. Every stick and handful of mud holds the story of hands that shaped it. Men dig shallow pits to anchor posts. Women patch gaps against the wind. There are no architects, no masons, yet only need and instinct. The first medieval homes are living things, grown as much as built, molded by weather and time. Beyond these huts, the land itself seems to slumber. Ancient Roman towns crumble under moss. Roads are broken, their stones taken to build farm walls. The aqueducts still stretch across the countryside like skeletons of a vanished world, silent witnesses to human ambition. But people no longer live for marble or monument. They live for mourning. The hum of tools returns, softly, an axe against wood, the creak of rope, the murmur of people working together. Across Europe, small clusters of huts begin to appear near rivers and clearings. Smoke marks these fragile new beginnings, like threads rising into the gray sky. And though no two huts are the same, each one carries the same purpose: to keep out the cold, the rain, and the dark. In the evenings, when light fades, the world turns to sound. A mother hums while grinding grain between stones. The lowing of cattle drifts from a rough enclosure outside. Somewhere, a dog barks at the rustle of leaves. The fire burns steadily, its glow painting trembling shadows upon the clay walls. There is no luxury here, but there is comfort in the closeness. The warmth of bodies, the rhythm of work, the security of routine. Beyond these small homes, the wilderness presses close. Wolves prowl the edges of light. The night sky, vast and unbroken, stretches from one horizon to the next. Stars guide the shepherds who sleep beneath cloaks, dreaming of dawn. The medieval world, in its infancy, belongs to the elements. Fire is both shield and companion. Wood is both weapon and wall. And every morning begins with gratitude for warmth, for food, for shelter that stands one more day. The world feels different now, slower, quieter, but alive with rebirth. People no longer think in empires, but in distances measured by footsteps. A village may be a day's walk, a monastery 2 days more. Time itself is measured by the sun's rise and fall, by the season of sowing and the season of rest. Still, not all is bleak. In these early centuries, something new begins to take root in the soil of hardship. Community. One hut becomes 2, then 5, then a dozen. People share tools, stories, and bread. When a roof collapses, neighbors come to lift it again. When a child is born, the village gathers to welcome it by the firelight. Slowly, these gatherings shape something enduring, the idea of belonging. It is in these small homes that the medieval soul is formed. The hearth, blackened with years of smoke, becomes the center of life. A place where warmth is shared and stories are told. A bowl of stew, a crust of bread, the sound of rain upon the roof. These are not luxuries, but quiet joys. Architecture, humble as it is, becomes an expression of faith in tomorrow. Occasionally, a traveler passes, a monk on the road, carrying news from distant lands, or a tinker with pots and tailies to trade. They bring whispers of old Rome, of kings rising in the north, of strange cities beyond the sea. But here, in this small clearing, those stories feel like dreams. The people live by what they can touch: the weight of wood, the crackle of fire, the rough fabric of wool. And as centuries pass, these modest shelters evolve. Walls grow thicker, roofs higher. Some begin to build with stone, learning from the ruins around them. Old Roman techniques, half remembered, find new purpose in medieval hands. A doorway is shaped from scavenged blocks, a hearth lined with broken tiles. Out of decay, beauty slowly begins again. If one were to walk across the continent in these centuries, one would find a patchwork of worlds: wooden cottages by the North Sea, turf-roofed dwellings in the highlands, stone huts in the southern hills. Every region tells its story through its materials. In the north, homes hug the ground against the wind. In the south, open courtyards welcome the sun. Architecture bends to the will of nature, humble yet ingenious. There are no drawings, no blueprints. Houses are built from memory, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Each family adds a beam here, a window there, a quiet legacy of adaptation. Over time, these little changes gather into tradition. The shape of the medieval home becomes familiar: a single room, a central hearth, and a roof steep enough to shed the rain. And so, the world rebuilds itself not through conquest, but through care. The great monuments of empire have fallen, yet in their absence, people rediscover what it means to live simply, to be sheltered, to be warm, to endure. When night comes again, with wind, the stars gleam above the thatched roofs like small lanterns in the endless dark. Within the huts, the fires dim, leaving only embers in the soft rhythm of sleep. The medieval world, fragile but determined, dreams its way into being one humble home at a time. The humble beginnings. Timber and thatch